Hi, it's Christine at Christine's Craft Table. Stepping away from the crafting for a minute today. You ever hear something that a great piece of news or just some story that you have to share and it's just too good to hold inside of you? That's how I felt this morning when I read my devotion. So I thought I'd share it. It might encourage someone. So here it is. Do you know the story of Joseph? It's pretty long in the Bible. It goes from Genesis chapter 37 to chapter 50. I encourage you to read it because it's a great story, one of the great stories in the Bible. In a nutshell, Joseph was the son to a father who had I guess it was 11 other sons, if I remember correctly. Forgive me if I don't. I think that's where the 12 tribes of Israel come from, is Jacob's sons. Anyhow, Joseph was the favorite of his father, and his father openly treated him as the favorite, and so his brothers were a little jealous about him. His father even had a wonderful coat made for Joseph. Apparently it was, really brilliant in color and just something really special to set Joseph apart. And of course, his brothers were jealous. And then Joseph had some dreams that irritated his brothers when he shared his dreams. He basically dreamt that he was elevated above his brothers and they were bowing down to worship him. In fact, his father was even bowing down to him. I think that irritated his father as well. And it was a fascinating story because it was given to him in symbolism. First it was stalks of wheat, and the stalks of wheat were bowing to his stalk of wheat, which was, the greatest. I think it was the sun and the moon and the stars were bowing to him. I can't even remember all the details now, and I'm sorry about that. But the whole deal was that he had these dreams that his brothers found very offensive. And he still shared them with them, like, typical little brother, little sister has no filter, and they just overshare. And so as they grew up together, the brothers had this resentment against Joseph. And the brothers were the whole family was shepherds, so they would go out and shepherd the flocks, and Joseph would stay at home with his dad. And once his dad, the brothers had been gone for a while, and the dad sent Joseph to check up on them, and I think send them some provisions. I can't remember exactly, but he was sent to get a report for the dad of how the flocks were doing and how the brothers were doing. So when Joseph went to meet them, the brothers, I don't know who came up with the idea first, but they decided to, they threw Joseph in a pit. Yeah, they basically left him for dead. They decided this was their opportunity to get back at him, to get rid of him, not have to fuss with him anymore in their lives, and just to repay him for all the bitterness that they felt in their hearts. And that's what they did. They threw him in the pit. Now, one of the brothers secretly planned to go and rescue Joseph later, but that's neither here or there. He participated in the initial act. And so then they took Joseph's fancy coat that he had been wearing, and they soiled it with the blood of an animal that they killed, and took it to his father and said, "Look, we found is this your son's coat? Our brother." And implying that Joseph had been killed by a wild animal. And that's what Joseph's father thought, and he wept and grieved over him and basically considered him dead. And all the while, the brothers knew what they had done. And later, the one did go back to see if he could rescue Joseph, but by then, something else had happened to Joseph. No, correction. They were going to leave Joseph in the pit, but then they saw a caravan coming by of nomads traveling through the area, and they decided to sell Joseph as a slave and basically profit from this little deed that they had done. So they took him out of the pit and sold him as a slave. And apparently Joseph had no say in this, and he was handed over to these strangers who took him to Egypt and sold him as a slave there. And he was put up in the market for sale. So meanwhile, the brothers had gone back to the dad and told him the story of him being killed. So Joseph was taken to Egypt, and he was sold to I don't know what his position was. He was a ruler under Pharaoh, and he was a rich man, and he had lots of property and slaves and I guess agriculture. I can't remember what his business was, but he bought Joseph. And as Joseph served him, he saw how responsible he was, and all that he touched was blessed and prospered. And Joseph rose in his opinion and in his service, and became basically his number one foreman. And he didn't have to worry about anything because Joseph was taking care of it. And that Egyptian prospered with Joseph as his foreman. And probably Joseph was second in command in that household. Now, Joseph was a good-looking young man, and his owner's wife took a liking to him, and she connived to isolate him in the house with her and basically threw herself at him. And Joseph, in spite of all that he had suffered and his current situation as a slave, he still served God, and he was faithful to God, and he kept to the teachings of his God. And he knew that adultery was wrong, and he wasn't about to give in to this woman. And so he fled from her. And she grabbed a hold of his coat or his garment, whatever, his outer garment that he was wearing, and kept it. And when her husband came home, she was angry because, of course, Joseph had rebuffed her, and so she was going to get back at him. And she told a lie and told her husband that, look what your wonderful foreman did. He found me alone in the house and came to take advantage of me, and here, look, I still have his cloak. Well, poor Joseph just couldn't catch a break. So the husband had no choice but to believe his wife, and he had Joseph put in prison. Yep. And so Joseph was now a prisoner, and once again, he proved himself. He was the model prisoner, and he ended up taking care of the other prisoners and basically serving as an assistant to the jailer. And the jailer didn't need to worry about anything as long as Joseph was there, because he was taking care of things. And he served him well. And the jailer was very happy with him. And one day, the king, or the Pharaoh, it's a long story, I tell you, but I have to get to the part where the devotion was about this morning, so you know the history. Anyway, so one day the Pharaoh got upset with his chief cupbearer and his baker. The chief cupbearer is the guy who basically tested the wine before it was given to Pharaoh to drink. And he would hand him the cup of wine, and so he's called the chief cupbearer. And the baker, of course, was the head baker in Pharaoh's bakery, baking his bread. Anyway, he got upset with the two of them, and he threw them in jail. And when they were in jail, they both had dreams, and they were really troubled about their dreams. And Joseph was serving them and noticed their troubled nature and asked them, what's wrong? And so they each told him their dreams. They had, we had these horrible dreams and they're really bugging us. Sorry, the cupbearer had dreamed that he was back in the palace and handed Pharaoh his cup of wine to drink. And oh my goodness, I can't remember the details of that dream, but the dream, God gave Joseph the interpretation of that dream. And he said, well, this dream means that in 3 days you're going to be in front of Pharaoh again, serving him as you always had. So the baker heard the interpretation of the cupbearer's dream and thought, oh, well, maybe mine's good too. So he told Joseph his dream, and his dream had to do with him carrying a basket of bread over his head, and the birds came and kept eating the bread. And Joseph gave him the bad news that within 3 days, Pharaoh would be basically chopping off his head. And come to pass 3 days, that's exactly what happened. The cupbearer was restored to his position, the baker was executed, and his head was chopped off. So Joseph now had this reputation that he could interpret dreams. And he gave all the credit to God. He said, this isn't of me. God gave me these interpretations. And time went on. Joseph kept serving the jailer. And then come one day when Pharaoh has a dream. And his dreams are very troubling. And he consults his wise men, his magicians, his counselors, and nobody knew the interpretation of his dream and could not help him. And so he was very troubled. Well, then I forgot to mention that Joseph asked the cupbearer to remember him when he was restored in 3 days to the Pharaoh. But of course he forgot him. He went back to his old job and didn't think about Joseph again. Well, when Pharaoh had these dreams, later, I think it was years later, he remembered Joseph and he said, wait a minute, I know a guy. As far as I know, he's still in prison. And he interpreted my dream. He told me that I was going to be restored and, serve you again. He can interpret dreams. Let's get him. So sure enough, Pharaoh ordered that Joseph be brought to him. They cleaned him up and sent him before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh, ruler of the land of Egypt, told Joseph his dream. And it had to do with there coming a great famine in Egypt. Again, it was symbolic. I think it was some cows that became famished and lean and gaunt, and basically another cow ate them, and that cow was still lean and gaunt. And then another vision which meant the same thing, which demonstrated the same principle. And so Joseph said, well, Pharaoh, it's not me, okay? First of all, it's God that gives me the interpretation. So let me see if he will tell me what your dreams mean. And Pharaoh didn't actually tell Joseph what the dream was. God actually told Joseph first what the dream was and then what it meant. So Pharaoh knew Joseph wasn't just pulling this out of his hat. He actually told him what he had dreamed. Nobody else could do that. So anyhow, the interpretation of the dream was that Egypt was going to go through a severe famine. I think it was 7 years of famine. And they needed to prepare because before that famine, they were going to have a number of years of great prosperity. So during the years of prosperity, they had to store up because the 7 years of famine were coming. So Joseph told Pharaoh, your best course is to choose somebody really wise to head up this campaign of storing up food for the famine that's coming, and you will save your people. And Pharaoh said, I don't know anybody else wiser than you, Joseph, so you're the man. You will be second in me to command over all Egypt, and you'll coordinate all this food gathering and distributing when the time comes to distribute it to the people. So sure enough, Joseph again proved himself and was in charge of the collection of all the grain for those years of prosperity. And when the famine came, they were ready. And the Bible says first the people came and they bought grain from Joseph. And then the next year the famine continued. So they sold all their belongings to Joseph. And still, the famine continued on. And so eventually they sold themselves to Joseph and said, we're your slaves, give us food, and he did. And basically everybody was in slavery to Pharaoh. Now, Joseph was wise, so he didn't, I think they had to return a certain portion. It sounded like sharecropping, where you farm the land and a certain portion comes back to the owner, and they keep a portion to live on and to plant again the next year. So through all this, Joseph saved the land of Egypt through that famine and saw them through it. And during this time, the Israelites, living not too far away, but a ways away from Egypt, heard of the grain that was in Egypt during the famine. And so Jacob sent his remaining sons over to Egypt to buy grain, because they were also starving where they were at in Canaan. And so they went, and the first time they went, Joseph was actually in charge of doling out the grain when people came to buy. He recognized his brothers, and they didn't recognize him because, of course, now he looked Egyptian. He wore the full garb of a ruler in Egypt, and probably wore, I don't know, the makeup. The movie depiction shows him wearing makeup. I believe the Egyptian men wore makeup. Anyway, his brothers didn't recognize him, and he recognized them. And so he played some games with them and basically inquired of his father and found out his father was still alive, and questioned them very closely. And they were surprised at how closely he was able to question them about their father. And they ended up telling him about their younger brother, who was Joseph's only full brother. They were all like half brothers, because Jacob, his dad, so the brothers were scattered among 4 different women as mothers, and Joseph and his younger brother were the only 2 from Rebekah. So that was the brother he was closest to, and the youngest brother in the whole family. So he found out that they were still alive and well, and that was the only brother that didn't come to Egypt to buy grain, because he was the youngest and the favorite, the new favorite of Jacob's. And so he kept him at home. And Joseph wanted to see his younger brother, so he said, I will sell you grain. First of all, he treated them very well. He fed them. He sold them the grain, and then he had his servants put the grain back, or the money back, in their satchels to take home with them. And he said, if you return to me, I want to see your younger brother. Don't return again to me without bringing your younger brother. That's how Joseph accused them of being spies. He actually had the servant follow them out of the city or out of the country, and then catch them with the money that had been returned to their satchels, and then accuse them of being spies. And anyhow, he said, the only way you'll prove to me you're not spies is if you bring your younger brother, who you told me about, back with you. Of course, Joseph himself just wanted to see his younger brother. So the brothers, incredulous, but thankful that they were able to return to their home, went back home and told their father all of this. And they went on with their lives. Well, the grain runs out in Canaan again, and their dad says, go back to Egypt, buy more grain, we're going to die here. And they said, we can't, Dad. The ruler told us we cannot return unless you send Benjamin, who is his younger brother, back with us. And their father said, y'all are going to kill me. Y'all are going to send me down to my grave. I can't let go of my youngest son. I already lost Joseph. Now you want me to give up Benjamin? And they said, well, don't send us back then, because he won't sell us any more grain unless we have our younger brother. He thought we were spies. So finally, Jacob has no choice. They're going to die, or, they're going to die slowly or quickly. His choice. So he sends Benjamin with them. And he says, if you don't bring him back, that's it for me. I'm dead, He would die of a broken heart, having lost his two favorite sons. Well, they returned to Egypt, and Joseph, he actually clears the room when they return with his younger brother, because he's overcome with emotion. And he eventually discloses to his brothers who he is, and they have a very tearful reunion. And they, first probably can't believe it. This brother who they sold into slavery, is now second in command in Egypt. But it was the truth, and it happened, and they were treated, amazingly well by Joseph. He gave them clothes and goods from Egypt, and sent them home and said, return to Egypt, all of you, bring Dad, bring the family, bring the flocks. I'll take care of you. I can now, we'll settle you in the land where you can pasture the sheep and dwell here in Egypt until this famine is over. And, Joseph told Pharaoh about all of this, and Pharaoh said, absolutely, send my, horses and chariots to bring your family back. And they can live here in Egypt. We'll take care of them. So they did. The whole clan came. I forget how many people it was. I think it might have been like 70. The Bible actually says how big the family was when they came to Egypt. And they stayed there, and they increased and prospered, and Joseph took care of them, and they dwelt there for years. And come the day now when Jacob, who is actually called Israel now, I should mention that. God changed his name to Israel. I keep calling him Jacob, but he changed his name to Israel. Anyway, he passed away. he got old. And the brothers started worrying that Jacob was actually holding this grudge all this time against them, and that he was going to punish them once Dad died. They thought, it's just amazing how people can hold on to these things, but that's my commentary. Okay, so they were worried when Dad died that Joseph was going to punish them for all they had done to him. Even after he took care of them, I guess they figured he had done all that for his dad and his little brother. The brothers decide, we're going to go and plead our case to Joseph. We're going to tell him that Dad said, to forgive us, to, basically let bygones be bygones after he died. And that's where my devotion came in. After all that, they're coming before Joseph to ask him, or to give him this story. Again, they're conniving, they're making things up, but I guess that's who they were. So I'll read you. It's just 7 verses, a few verses here. Genesis chapter 50, verse 15. It says, "And when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, 'It may be that Joseph will hate us and will fully repay us for all the evil which we did to him.' And they told Joseph the following order: 'Your father commanded before he died, saying, so you will say to Joseph, forgive, I pray you now, the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did to you evil. And now we pray you, forgive the transgression of the slaves of the God of your father.' And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. And his brothers also went and fell down before his face. And they said, look, we are your slaves. And Joseph said to them, don't be afraid, for am I in the place of God? And as for you, you meant evil against me. God meant it for good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save many people alive. Now therefore don't be afraid, I will nourish you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. So Joseph held no ill against his brothers, even after all that time, after all they had done to him, because he saw the end result. He saw clearly, anybody could see, I don't know why his brothers couldn't see it, that God had meant it all for good. God used that circumstance to bring about the salvation of his family and all of Egypt. Many people, and I'm sure many people from the surrounding cities came and were saved by that, storehouse that Joseph was able to accumulate because God gave him the interpretation of those dreams. All of those things that had happened. Now, I think it was over a period of 14 years since they sold him into slavery till all of this transpired. So this was a long time of suffering for Joseph. And yet he could see that God was in it the whole time. So the questions that were asked in my devotion, what fear did Joseph's brothers have? Well, they were afraid that he held this grudge against them and he was going to now punish them. How did Joseph react to their plea for forgiveness? He'd long forgiven them. He saw the master plan. He saw God's faithfulness through all of it. How did God use the brothers' sin to accomplish his own purposes? Again, he saved his people through that sinful act that the brothers had committed. So I don't need to spell it out any clearer, but there's so much application to us today when we suffer injustice or illness or myriad of things that we just don't understand. Have faith. Trust God. He's got a plan. His word says that he does, that when we choose to put our faith in God, when we believe in his son, Jesus Christ, we are no longer walking alone in this world. We are no longer without hope. We have an inheritance that is undefiled and incorruptible, and nobody can steal from us. That's heaven. But even here on earth, we're children of the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, God of gods, the only God. And he has all the resources at his disposal. So yeah, sometimes we have to walk through those valleys, through those very dark places. And sometimes we are the victims of unimaginable evil. But God can work through the worst thing. The worst thing in our eyes that we don't understand, that we just throw up our hands, and some people say there is no God, and how could God allow this, and where is God? You serve a God that doesn't exist. They're only using their immediate eyes. They're only using what they can see. All we can see is today and what went behind us. We can't see the future. Nobody can. Joseph could not even imagine what was going to transpire in his life and where he would end up. But he didn't lose faith. He knew that he served Almighty God, and he didn't know how it would work out, but he knew it would work out. And I think if we pay attention, even daily, he gives us glimpses of the hope that we can have and the trust that we can have in him. Sometimes in the smallest of ways, he shows me he is there, he's taking care of me, and even walking this earth on a day-to-day basis, there are moments of grace and mercy that fall upon my life that I don't deserve. Sometimes I didn't even ask for. Sometimes I ask for something and he gives me 10 times that, whatever I asked for. So all that to say, have faith, trust in God, check out the story yourself, and enjoy all the fine details, especially the few areas where I may have missed something. That was all from memory except for those few verses that I read. So I apologize if I got some of the details wrong. Genesis chapter 37 to chapter 50. Check it out. God bless you.